You know that person who walks into every room like they own it. The one whose confidence seems bulletproof, whose charm could melt steel, whose very presence demands attention. You've probably called them a narcissist. But here is what is going to blow your mind. That person you think loves themselves more than anything. Let me tell you about someone I call David. Every morning, David would stand in front of his bathroom mirror for exactly 12 minutes. Not because he was vain, though that is what everyone assumed. He stood there because he was terrified. Terrified that if he didn't check, recheck, and perfect every detail of his appearance, someone might see through the cracks. Someone might notice that beneath all that polish, all that swagger, all that seemingly unshakable confidence, there was a frightened child who never learned he was enough just as he was. You see, when we think about narcissism, we get it completely backwards. We imagine someone so in love with themselves that they can't see past their own reflection. But the psychological reality, it is the exact opposite. Narcissists don't love themselves too much. They love themselves too little. They're so convinced of their own inadequacy that they spend every waking moment building an elaborate fortress of perfection to hide behind. Think about this for a second. When was the last time you posted something on social media and then found yourself checking it obsessively, refreshing to see the likes, reading every comment, feeling a little rush when people engage and a little sting when they don't? That anxious need for validation, that is a tiny taste of what narcissists experience every single day. Except it is not just about one post. It is about their entire existence. The difference between you and someone with narcissistic traits isn't that they're more self-absorbed. It is that their self-worth has become completely dependent on external validation. You might feel good when people like your photo, but you can still feel okay about yourself when they don't. For them, every moment without admiration feels like proof that they're fundamentally flawed. Here is where it gets really fascinating from a psychological perspective. Researchers have discovered that narcissists often come from one of two very specific childhood environments. The first type grew up being told they were absolutely extraordinary, that they could do no wrong, that they were destined for greatness, that they were better than everyone else. Sounds like a dream childhood, right? Wrong. Because when you are constantly told you are perfect, you never learn how to handle being human. You never develop the emotional tools to cope with failure, criticism, or ordinariness. The second type experienced the complete opposite. They grew up feeling invisible, neglected, or only receiving love when they achieved something remarkable. These children learned that their worth was entirely conditional, that love had to be earned through performance, and that being just themselves wasn't enough. Both paths lead to the same destination, an adult who never feels safe being authentic because authenticity feels dangerous. So they create a persona, a carefully crafted version of themselves that seems invulnerable, impressive, worthy of admiration. But here is the cruel irony. The more successful this persona becomes at attracting attention, the more isolated the real person feels underneath it. Imagine living your entire life as an actor who can never leave the stage. Every conversation is a performance. Every relationship is an audience. Every quiet moment alone is filled with the terror that you might forget your lines. That is the psychological prison of narcissism. Now, you might be thinking, but narcissists seem so confident. They take up space. They demand attention. They act like they're God's gift to humanity. And you are absolutely right, they do. But what you are witnessing isn't confidence. It is overcompensation. It is like watching someone who is terrified of drowning frantically treading water and mistaking their frantic movements for expert swimming. Neuroscience has shown us something incredible about how narcissists' brains work. When they're in social situations, the regions of their brain associated with self-referential thinking light up like a Christmas tree. They're hyper, aware of themselves in every interaction, while you might walk into a party thinking about grabbing a drink or finding a friend to talk to. They're conducting a constant mental audit. Who is looking at me? Who is impressed? Who is dismissing me? How can I get more attention? What do I need to say or do to maintain my image? It is absolutely exhausting, and yet from the outside it can look effortless. The smile never wavers, the stories are always captivating, The posture screams confidence. It is a masterclass in performance, but it is also a tragedy because the performer is slowly dying inside. This brings us to one of the most uncomfortable truths about narcissism. Our society is absolutely addicted to it. We reward narcissistic traits constantly. Who gets the promotion? The person who quietly does excellent work, or the person who makes sure everyone knows about their achievements? Who becomes famous? The authentic artist sharing their truth, or the one who knows exactly how to craft their image for maximum impact? Who gets the most followers? The person posting genuine moments, or the one curating a perfect highlight reel? We live in a culture that has essentially gamified human worth. Social media platforms are designed like slot machines, giving us unpredictable rewards that keep us coming back for more. We're all little narcissists now, editing our lives for public consumption, chasing likes and shares and comments, like digital applause. And here is the thing that should really make us pause. Narcissists aren't aliens who landed on Earth with strange behavioral patterns. They're simply the extreme end of a spectrum we're all on. They're what happens when the cultural pressure to perform, to be special, to stand out gets turned up to 11. They're us, but with the volume cranked so high, it has become painful. Let me tell you about what it is actually like to be in a relationship with someone who has narcissistic traits. At first, it is intoxicating. They make you feel like the most important person in the world. They're charming, attentive, seemingly fascinated by everything about you. It is like being caught in the beam of the most powerful spotlight you've ever experienced. You feel special, chosen, seen in ways you never have before. But slowly, things start to shift. The spotlight that once made you feel so special starts to feel demanding. You realize it is not really about seeing you. It is about you seeing them, admiring them, validating them. The relationship becomes less about mutual connection and more about you serving as an audience for their ongoing performance. When you try to share your own struggles, they might seem uncomfortable or quickly redirect the conversation back to themselves. When you need support, they might be mysteriously unavailable. When you try to get closer to the real person behind all that charisma, you might hit an invisible wall. It is like trying to hug someone who is wearing armor. You can get close, but you can never quite touch them. This isn't necessarily because they're cruel or manipulative, though some can be. Often, it is because they literally don't know how to be intimate without performing. They've been acting for so long that they've forgotten where the character ends and they begin. Vulnerability feels like death to them because their entire sense of safety depends on maintaining the illusion of invincibility. But here is what is really tragic. Narcissists need relationships more than anyone else. They're like emotional vampires, but not because they're evil. Because they're starving. They need constant reassurance, constant admiration, constant proof that they matter because they can't generate that sense of worth internally. But the very defenses they've built to protect themselves make it impossible for them to receive the genuine love they're desperately seeking. It is like being incredibly thirsty, but only being able to drink salt water. The more you drink, the thirstier you become, but you don't know any other way to quench your thirst. Now, you might be wondering, if narcissism is so painful, if it is rooted in such deep insecurity, can it ever change? Can someone who has spent their entire life behind a mask ever learn to take it off? The answer is complicated, but it is not hopeless. Change is possible, but it requires something that feels impossible to someone with narcissistic traits. It requires them to admit they're not perfect. It requires them to acknowledge that the very thing they've built their identity around, their specialness, their superiority, their invincibility, isn't real. This usually happens in one of two ways. Sometimes life delivers a blow so significant that the mask becomes impossible to maintain. A major relationship ends, a career crumbles, a health crisis hits, the external validation they've depended on disappears, and they're forced to confront the emptiness underneath. Change happens more gradually through therapy. But not just any therapy. It has to be with someone who understands that beneath all that apparent arrogance is a wounded child who never learned they were lovable just as they are. The therapist has to be skilled enough to challenge the narcissistic patterns, while still providing the safety and validation the person needs to risk being vulnerable. Progress is slow and often painful. Imagine spending your entire life believing that showing weakness means certain rejection, and then being asked to share your deepest fears and insecurities. It is like asking someone with a severe phobia of heights to bungee jump for therapy. But when it works, when someone with narcissistic traits begins to develop genuine self-compassion and empathy for others, it is like watching someone come alive for the first time. The key insight that often sparks change is this: the very thing they've been trying to achieve through their performance. Being loved and accepted is only possible when they stop performing. Real love can only attach to a real person, not to a carefully constructed image. This brings us to something profound that studying narcissism teaches us about human nature. We all exist on this spectrum between authenticity and performance. We all have moments where we choose image over truth, where we edit ourselves for approval, where we hide our flaws and amplify our strengths. The difference is one of degree and awareness. Most of us can catch ourselves when we're performing and choose to be more genuine. Most of us can feel satisfied by authentic connections, even when they don't involve admiration. Most of us can tolerate being ordinary sometimes, because we know our worth doesn't depend entirely on being special. But narcissists have gotten stuck at the extreme end of this spectrum. They're like people who started wearing a costume for Halloween and then never took it off. Over the years, the costume became more elaborate, more convincing, more necessary for basic functioning. And now they're terrified that if they take it off, there will be nothing underneath. Here is what is really fascinating. There are actually two different types of narcissism that psychologists have identified. The first is what we typically think of: grandiose narcissism. These are the people who seem larger than life, who dominate conversations, who appear supremely confident and often arrogant. They're the classic narcissists we see in movies and read about in psychology books. But there is another type called vulnerable or covert narcissism, and it is much harder to spot. These individuals might actually appear shy, sensitive, or even humble on the surface. But underneath, they're dealing with the same fundamental issues: a fragile sense of self, and desperate need for validation, and difficulty forming genuine connections. Vulnerable narcissists might not boast about their achievements, but they might constantly seek reassurance about their worth. They might not demand attention aggressively, but they might feel deeply wounded when they don't receive it. They might not appear arrogant, but they might have a secret belief that they're special or that others don't understand them. This is important because it shows us that narcissism isn't always loud and obvious. Sometimes it is quiet and hidden. Sometimes it looks like depression or anxiety rather than confidence and charisma. The common thread isn't the behavior, it is the underlying emotional experience of feeling fundamentally inadequate while desperately needing others to prove otherwise. So what does all of this mean for how we think about and interact with narcissists in our lives? First, it means we can approach them with more compassion without excusing harmful behavior. Understanding that someone's arrogance comes from deep insecurity doesn't mean you have to tolerate being treated poorly. You can maintain healthy boundaries while still seeing the wounded person behind the mask. Second, it means we can use narcissism as a mirror for our own psychological patterns. When you feel irritated by someone's need for attention, ask yourself, where do I seek attention in ways that might be unhealthy? When you are frustrated by someone's inability to be vulnerable, ask yourself, where do I hide behind my own masks? The things that bother us most about others are often reflections of our own unexamined shadows. Third, it reminds us that authenticity is not just a nice ideal, it is a psychological necessity. When we consistently choose performance over genuineness, when we build our identity around external validation, when we hide our true selves out of fear of rejection, we're walking toward the same psychological prison that traps narcissists. The antidote to narcissism, both in ourselves and in our relationships with others, is radical authenticity combined with unconditional self-acceptance. It is the courage to be seen as ordinary, flawed, and human. It is the willingness to be loved for who we are, rather than admired for who we pretend to be. Imagine if David, the man I told you about at the beginning, could stand in front of his mirror one morning, and instead of checking for flaws and perfecting his image, he could simply look into his own eyes and say, "You are enough. You don't need to be extraordinary to be loved. You don't need to perform to have worth." That moment would be revolutionary. That moment would be healing. That moment would free him from the exhausting performance he has been giving his entire life. And here is the beautiful truth. That same revolutionary moment is available to all of us. We don't have to wait until we're diagnosed with something, or until our lives fall apart. We can choose authenticity over performance right now. We can choose connection over admiration. We can choose to be real rather than right, vulnerable rather than invincible, human rather than perfect. The psychology of narcissism teaches us that the human soul doesn't need applause. It needs acceptance. It doesn't need to be admired. It needs to be known. It doesn't need to be flawless. It needs to be forgiven. And when we truly understand this, we realize that narcissists aren't our opposite. They're an extreme version of our own deepest fears and longings. So the next time you encounter someone whose confidence seems too polished, whose need for attention seems too intense, whose emotional walls seem too high, remember this: you might be looking at the most vulnerable person in the room. Behind every narcissistic mask is a child who learned too early that love was something to be earned rather than something to be received freely. And maybe, if we can see them clearly, we can see ourselves more clearly too. Maybe we can all find the courage to take off our masks, to be ordinary and extraordinary at the same time, to be loved, not for our performances, but for our truth. Because in the end, that is what we all want, isn't it? To be known and loved as we really are. Narcissists just took a longer, more painful route to discover what the rest of us are still learning. That the very thing we're trying so hard to achieve through our masks is only possible when we have the courage to take them off.